All right, hello. This is homework 2B. So today we're going to be talking about the roles and powers of the president. First of all, the president is part of the executive branch. The executive branch is going to be the president on top, then the vice president, and then the cabinet and the executive office. We will talk more about the cabinet later on, but most of what we're going to be focusing on in this video is going to be talking about the president and a little bit about the vice president. So let's talk about the powers of the president. There are formal powers and informal powers. Formal powers are going to be things that are in the Constitution, first of all, and things that are like officially his job. The informal powers are things that are still his job, but they're not like written down in the job description. They're not technically his job, but he still does them and is allowed to do them. So let's start with formal powers of vetoes. Vetoes and pocket vetoes. They are both vetoes, but they are a little bit different. They're formal powers that enable the president to check Congress. Veto is an override of a law, and it's a refusal to sign that law to sign it into law, right? But vetoes can be overridden with a 2/3 majority vote. Pocket vetoes cannot be overridden. So, for example, in 2015, there was a law to fund the Keystone XL pipeline, and President Obama used a traditional veto to block a bill authorizing it. Congress was in session, and so it was returned to them, and so the veto stood because it was a Republican-led Congress, but they could not muster a 2/3 majority to override that veto. On the other hand, with a pocket veto, this is a non-overridable legislative maneuver where the president is not taking any action. So he doesn't sign it, but he doesn't formally veto it either during the final 10 days of a congressional session. And so if Congress adjourns before that 10-day session, it basically expires. And so it means that the bill can't be returned back to Congress, and it's just done. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't actually veto it back to them, but it's in those last 10 days, and so they don't have time to do anything about it. And so, for example, Bill Clinton actually did this with this bill called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act because Congress was about to adjourn for Christmas. And so this kind of like a silent killer in that if the president doesn't sign it and then Congress adjourns within those 10 days, there's no chance for an override. Okay. Another formal power of the president is going to be foreign policy. So the president is our commander-in-chief, which means he is the head of the military. And so anything that has to do with foreign nations, diplomacy, things like that, is going to be the president, as well as treaties. However, the Senate has to approve the treaties. And then executive orders, these are orders by the president to manage the federal government. So an executive order cannot be just anything, and we will talk more in class about what an executive order can and can't be, but it basically is an order to regulate the executive branch itself, specifically the federal bureaucracy, the executive office, things like that. And so this is a power implied by his executive power, and can be really, really powerful tool for the president. Informal powers, foreign policy, executive agreements. These are going to be kind of like treaties, but they're more of a handshake, right? More like, okay, we won't go to war with you if you don't go to war with us, but it's not technically a treaty, so it doesn't have to be approved by the Senate. Okay. Bargaining and persuasion. This is a big one. LBJ was a master of this. Okay. For example, he got the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, and a lot of people attribute that to him, even though the president doesn't pass laws. But he helped get it passed because he didn't just give speeches and say, hey guys, you should pass this bill. He invited senators to the White House. He schmoozed. He used their knowledge or their personal lives in their districts to kind of like put pressure on them, saying, hey, you really need to get this signed if you know what's good for you. Traded favors, right? And so that's kind of a presidential power. And that's in opposition to the bully pulpit, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. Ronald Reagan was a really big user of the bully pulpit. So we'll talk more about that in a sec. And then signing statements. This is an informal power. It informs Congress and the president or the public of the president's intentions. and his interpretation of a law when signing it. And so if, for example, the president has to sign a law but doesn't necessarily agree with some of the language, or maybe he likes the language but feels like it's a little vague and doesn't want it to get misconstrued, what he can do is he can sign the law but also issue what's called a signing statement, which is basically like a little asterisk or like a footnote saying, okay, I'm signing this, but here's how I'm interpreting this law. And it doesn't actually have real power in and of itself, but if that law gets appealed or brought to the Supreme Court, that signing statement can be a good indicator of maybe how that law was intended, especially years down the line. Okay, now let's talk about the checks on the presidency. So remember, checks and balances, each branch can check the other branches. The legislative branch can check the president through Senate confirmation. So the president decides who's in his cabinet, right? And we said we were going to talk about that later. The cabinet is going to be the president's advisors, right? So there's a Secretary of Defense, a Secretary of the Treasury, a Secretary of Education, right? And so all these people are his advisors and experts in their fields, and so he appoints them. The Senate has to confirm them, so he can't just put in all his besties and say, I just want, my best friend and my wife and my mom. Like, they have to actually kind of be people who are somewhat qualified, and the Senate will confirm, hopefully, that they are qualified for that position. They also confirm ambassadors, some of the executive office members, and then federal judges and justices, specifically Supreme Court justices are going to be a big one there. And so the Senate confirmation is a really important check on appointment powers. The president's longest lasting influence often lies in those life tenure justices in the Supreme Court. And so a lot of times that can create some tension. In 1991, the Supreme Court had Clarence Thomas appointed, and this was like a firestorm of controversy. Oh my gosh. The people were so upset about Clarence Thomas over, his ideology and some kind of like scandals he had had. And then again in 2020, Amy Coney Barrett was appointed, and that was really, really close to an election, and kind of shows how the Senate can use this power to kind of check the president's power and use it kind of as a political tool. And then the president, keep in mind, he can serve for 4 or 8 years, but the people he appoints can serve for 30, 40 years. Like Clarence Thomas served for over 30 years. That can shape policy long after he has stepped down or died or, left office. And then keep in mind that policy conflicts can lead to then executive orders, because sometimes the president and the legislature can disagree, especially if it's a split government, right? Like one's one party, the other's the other party. Or if there's like a lot of gridlock, the president a lot of times will use executive orders to kind of get around that and control bureaucracy. For example, President Obama couldn't get the DREAM Act, which is a law that regulates immigration and allows certain people to stay in the country without as much documentation. And so he actually used an executive order when that law couldn't get passed through a gridlocked Congress to direct the Department of Homeland Security to kind of change how they prioritize deportation. So it's not that he passed the law himself, but you'd say he created an executive order to kind of get around it. And that happens with every presidency. So the president's power has kind of expanded throughout the years. Originally, the presidency was designed to be a very, very weak office, and it has since expanded in power. A document you need to know is Federalist 70. So this is the, I think, 6th document. We've done Declaration, Articles, Constitution, Federalist 10, Federalist 51. So this is number 6. Federalist 70, you need to know, offers justification for a single executive. And this is where the Federalists argue that a single strong executive is going to be essential to the protection of the country, specifically against foreign attacks. So basically, we saw this during the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Those 13 days. JFK had to make a lot of split-second decisions, quite literally, like within minutes. Okay, this is what we're going to do next. And if there had been some committee, we could have been a nuclear war, right? And so it's easier if there's a single executive controlling the military, so we don't have to vote on every single military decision, especially in the heat of the moment in a literal battle. And then the administration of the laws, the protection of property, security of liberty. So it's a lot about that security, right? Like the physical security. Also, though, the 22nd Amendment, limited federal presidential power, though. So before the 22nd Amendment, Washington had stepped down after 2 terms, and so he had set this precedent, right, this example. And every president after him had stepped down after 1 or 2 terms to follow that example. FDR broke this during World War II and then the Great Depression, and that whole 30s, 40s era, right? And the 22nd Amendment ended up getting ratified to kind of react to that fear of a constitutional monarch, because they wanted to create structures in place to check that expansion of presidential power. And so a lot of debate has happened throughout history in what the president's role is, right? We start with the, Articles of Confederation before we were even a country with no president. And then we add a president in the Constitution with Article 2, which, by the way, you do need to know that Article 2 is where the presidency is established. And then we start to expand presidential power, especially through like FDR and those sort of things. And then we start to limit power again. And so kind of how much power the president should have has been hotly debated. You also need to know about presidential communication. This is pretty simple, but basically it's just the idea that the president can communicate with the public. It used to be through the radio. We used to have like fireside chats with Roosevelt, right? And then nowadays that comes in the form of internet and social media, right? President Trump a lot of times communicates with his constituents, America, through Truth Social, used to be Twitter or X. Or he can sometimes post on Facebook or Instagram. And then he can also email his constituents or his supporters, rather, if they've signed up for that. And so modern technology has really shifted how the president can communicate with the public. Television, right? Another example of presidential communication is the State of the Union address, and this is televised, and this is a speech that the president gives to Congress every year, and basically it is a State of the Union. How is the Union, the country, doing? And then we get to the bully pulpit, right? And so this is the idea that the president can kind of set an agenda for the country. Even if he can't actually create laws, he can use that bargaining and persuasion power through his power on Congress or on the public. And so a lot of times the bully pulpit is more about talking to the public and saying, hey, everybody, you should support XYZ, and here's why. And so we have seen that throughout the years with the president. So, for example, President Obama engaged in the bully pulpit during the mid-2000s or the late 2000s with healthcare reform. And so he often gave speeches urging the public to support the ACA, which is the Affordable Care Act, also called Obamacare, and touting its benefits and saying, you need to support this. This is going to be good for the country, and really getting the public support for that agenda. And that's called the bully pulpit. You need to know that, and it is frequently on your AP exam. This can influence policy, because if the president is up on a pulpit, literally or figuratively, saying, hey, everybody, we should support XYZ cause, well, if that is influencing the public will then call their congresspeople and say, hey, I'm not voting for you if you don't support XYZ cause, and then the congresspeople will be influenced then to take action. So that wraps up homework 2B, and I'll see you next time.